Paula Olera was born in Colombia in the late 1970s to her parents, Cesar and Olga Olera. She had two older siblings, Julio and Alexandra. In June 1990, Paula, along with her mother and two siblings, relocated to East Harlem, New York City, seeking a better life. They lived on the 30th floor of an apartment building at 420 East 111th Street, sharing the space with Paula's uncle, Guillermo Ospina. Her father, Cesar, stayed in Colombia, working as a taxi driver and saving money to eventually join them in New York. Upon arriving in New York, Paula began attending junior high school 90. According to her sister, Alexandra, Paula excelled academically, dedicating her free time to studying English and mathematics. She had only a few friends, primarily classmates, and dreamed of becoming a lawyer to assist those in need. Her uncle Guillermo described her as exceptionally intelligent and mature for her age, thinking well beyond her years. He also mentioned that Paula was very happy in New York due to her passion for the English language. She was a young girl with many plans for the future, her uncle Guillermo said. Everything appeared to be going smoothly for Paula and her family until a heartbreaking event suddenly changed their lives. On the cold afternoon of January 24, 1991, Paula, who was just 13 years old at the time, left her school and made her way back to the familiar surroundings of her apartment building. Discover the chilling world of secret crime mysteries, where we delve into the most perplexing cold cases and unsolved crimes. Join us as we unravel hidden clues and explore haunting mysteries. Subscribe now and be part of the journey to bring these cases to light. At approximately 4:45 p.m., she arrived at the entrance of the building and used the intercom to call her apartment. Her mother, Olga, answered and let her in by pressing the button to unlock the lobby door. This ordinary interaction would be the final one Olga would share with her beloved daughter. With the door now open, Paula entered the lobby and stepped into an elevator. But tragically, she never made it to their 30th floor apartment. 10 minutes later, when Paula hadn't arrived home, her brother and uncle grew worried. They felt that something was amiss and decided to go look for her. As they hurried down to the lobby, they found it completely empty. They began searching the neighborhood desperately for Paula, but it was as if she had vanished into thin air. 3 hours later, around 7:30 p.m., a man out for a walk with his dog made a chilling discovery. He spotted a lifeless figure lying on a walkway near the East River. The area was littered with drug-related items like vials, syringes, and used lighters. Tragically, what he found was Paula's slender body, and she had passed away. The site where she was found was located about a half a mile to the south of the apartment building where she lived. When detectives arrived at the scene, they were faced with a deeply saddening sight. There were no clues to indicate who might have committed this crime. The only things they discovered on Paula's body were a new Kids on the Block watch on her wrist and a piece of chalk in her pocket. Paula's murder profoundly affected not only her family but also the entire neighborhood. Her mother Olga was inconsolable, struggling to come to terms with the loss of her daughter. At Paula's school, both students and teachers were in shock. In the aftermath of this tragedy, teachers held meetings with students to provide support for those who were close to Paula, helping them cope with their grief. They also advised all students not to walk alone in the area for safety reasons. In response to the incident, reporters were not allowed to access the school, and the principal and district officials declined to speak with them. Detectives were left with numerous unanswered questions. They went from door to door in the 32-floor building, hoping to find witnesses who might have seen Paula in the area where her body was eventually discovered. Unfortunately, they couldn't locate anyone who had seen her there. Moreover, the detectives had no information about the appearance of the person responsible for this tragedy. It remained uncertain whether Paula was killed in the isolated spot filled with crack vials where her body was found or somewhere else. Through their investigation, the detectives managed to piece together some important details. They discovered that Paula regularly stayed at school after hours for a journalism workshop on Thursdays. On the day of her tragic murder, she had been working on an article about her father, intending to send it to him as a Valentine's Day gift. The detectives also found out that on that fateful day, Paula left the school after the workshop at around 4 p.m. and walked north along First Avenue with a friend. They parted ways at 106th Street, with Paula continuing to her family's apartment building. During their inquiries, the detective learned that another teenager named Aaron Wofford had entered the same elevator as Paula. However, when they spoke with him, he claimed to have gotten off at the 19th floor while Paula continued upward. As a result, the detective shifted their focus away from him as a suspect. The autopsy revealed the full extent of the terrible ordeal Paula had endured. She had been violated, strangled, and stabbed 3 times near her heart. The medical examiner also noticed unusual elongated marks on her thighs. It was clear that Paula had bravely resisted an assault, and her attacker had forcefully separated her legs, causing bruises on their thighs that matched the shape of their fingers. The examiner also collected male hair from her body. This was stored as evidence. On February 2, 1991, Paula's body was laid to rest at St. Michael's Cemetery in East Elmhurst, Queens. For months later, after her tragic murder, Paula's family decided to relocate to Flushing, New York, and they received support from Victim Services, a private nonprofit organization that assists victims of violent crimes and their families. In Flushing, Olga sought solace through counseling at the Families of Homicide Victims program, also run by Victim Services. As the family continued to cope and heal, they held on to the hope of achieving justice for Paula. However, as this time passed, Paula's case gradually grew colder and the quest for answers became increasingly challenging. The murder of a 13-year-old girl should have been a major news story in any city at any time. However, in the violence-ridden New York of 1991, this dreadful crime in East Harlem was largely unnoticed. Between 1990 and 1992, the city reported over 2,000 murders each year, with an average of 6 bodies discovered daily across the 5 boroughs of New York City. Unfortunately, most of these occurred in impoverished, predominantly minority neighborhoods, such as East Harlem, the South Bronx, and East New York, Brooklyn. Regrettably, very few of these cases received significant attention from the media. Instead, the media often focused on more upscale crimes involving white wealthy victims in picturesque locations. Without the pressure from the media or politicians, Paula's case became a low-priority homicide. Consequently, her murder remained unsolved and largely forgotten throughout much of the 1990s. By the mid-1990s, crime rates in New York City were on the decline. However, in the housing projects of East Harlem, a disturbing trend persisted. A series of seemingly unrelated incidents began to occur, all involving the assault and murder of young, attractive teenagers with large skin regardless of whether they were black or Hispanic. In 1994, a 15-year-old girl became a victim when she was confronted by an attacker brandishing a knife. This case revealed a consistent pattern used by the assailant, which he would repeat multiple times over the next 4 years. He would approach the teenager from behind and guide her to an isolated location. There he would blindfold her using a piece of her own clothing, coerce her to undress, and then subject her to assault. Remarkably, the 15-year-old survivor was able to provide a description of her attacker. He was a well-groomed young man with a muscular build, and he displayed an excessive sense of self-importance. Shockingly, he even told the victim that she should consider herself fortunate to be assaulted by someone as good-looking as himself. A few years later, on September 10, 1997, firefighters responded to a rooftop fire at the George Washington houses on East 104th Street. In the aftermath, they discovered the lifeless body of a woman who had suffered severe abuse, had been struck with a blunt object, and was burnt so badly that she was unrecognizable. This victim was later identified as 19-year-old Joyce Casper, who had moved to New York from the Dominican Republic with her family. Joyce, a young mother with a daughter, had been pursuing her studies in computer science at a community college in the Bronx. 7 months later, in April 1998, a 13-year-old girl was the next victim in the same neighborhood. Thankfully, this young victim managed to escape with her life. 2 months after that, on June 2, 1998, 17-year-old Rashida Washington met a tragic end. She was found in a 15th floor stairwell of an East 112th Street housing project, having been robbed, assaulted, and strangled. Her lifeless body with its naked torso covered by a shirt had been positioned in a seated stance against the wall. Similar to the earlier victims, Rashida, a fashion student who worked at a clothing boutique, was petite, weighing only 100 pounds. Tragically, she was murdered just 3 days after celebrating her 18th birthday. In that same year, during the fall, 2 more young teenagers fell victim to assaults in the same area. A 15-year-old was attacked on September 25, 1998, followed by a 14-year-old on November 16th. Thankfully, these 2 adolescents survived, likely because they didn't get a good look at the attacker before being blindfolded. Even as these similar cases continued to accumulate, the police did not publicly acknowledge the possibility of a serial murderer targeting teenage girls in East Harlem. However, due to the concerns raised by the parents of the victims, the police eventually decided to take prompt action. In the 1990s, there was a relatively small database of DNA samples on record because of widespread testing of convicted felons had not yet begun. However, a significant breakthrough had occurred in the autumn of 1998 concerning the East Harlem cases. New York police experts in forensics compared bodily fluid evidence from the Rashida Washington murder with evidence from 2 other similar cases in the neighborhood. These tests conclusively linked the same perpetrator to all 3 crimes. Finally, detectives had solid evidence confirming the existence of a serial criminal preying on teenagers in Harlem. In response, police leadership assembled a specialized task force comprising detectives with the sole mission of apprehending the suspect. The police took action by distributing a wanted poster that included a sketch of the serial attacker. This sketch was based on descriptions provided by the victims. Shortly after posting the flyer in East Harlem, a tipster who called and suggested that the detectives should closely investigate a 25-year-old man known as Ace who resided on the 19th floor of the same building where Paula had lived. The police quickly identified Ace's real name as Aaron Key, and this name triggered a memory. The name Aaron had initially surfaced during Paula's murder investigation. Detectives recalled the teenager named Aaron Wofford, who had been seen entering the elevator at the same time as Paula and had claimed to have exited on the 19th floor. The distinctive first name, Iran, had also reappeared in the investigation of Joyce Casper's murder in 1997. Phone records showed that in the days leading up to her death, Joe Hayes had made numerous calls to a man named Aaron Key. When questioned by the police, Aaron explained that Joe Hayes had been a friend of his girlfriend, Jacqueline. He accounted for his numerous phone calls by stating that the 2 women had been planning a shopping trip on the day of Jaya's murder. The police also interviewed Jacqueline, who confirmed Aaron's explanation. It was only later that the police realized that Aaron Wofford and Aaron Key were actually the same person. Wofford was his father's last name and Key was his mother's. This revelation connected Iran Key to 2 out of the 3 victims in the suspected serial killer case. He was the last person known to have seen Paula alive, and there was a significant history of phone communication between him and Joe Hayes in the days leading up to her death. These connections could not only have been coincidence. Detectives decided to dig deeper into Iran's background. They found that he was an intelligent and reasonably well-spoken individual. He was born on September 18, 1973, and he had spent most of his childhood in East Harlem. During the time of Paula's disappearance in 1991, he was living with relatives in the same building as her. Iran was known as a charming person with a knack for computers. He claimed to be involved in rap music production, although there was little evidence to support this claim. Physically, he stood just 5 feet 8 inches and he was fairly handsome. His criminal record showed only 1 arrest for robbery in 1990, and he had spent little or no time behind bars. However, neighbors had a different perspective on Iran. They described him as having a troubling side. He had a habit of peering through the peepholes of women in his building, and he often wandered around with a portable video camera attempting to capture inappropriate footage. At this stage, the police didn't have much substantial evidence against Iran, but they understood the importance of a thorough investigation. They focused on the assailant involved in the September 1998 incident, who had left behind a black boo-boo cap and a gray sweatshirt. The detectives decided to look closer into these clothing items for leads. Their efforts paid off when they found a laundry tag on one of the garments. This tag eventually led the police to a dry cleaner located near Iran's building. What made this discovery even more significant was that the client list at this dry cleaner included Aaron's mother, Cynthia. Every piece of information seemed to point to Aaron as a prime suspect, and law enforcement was increasingly convinced that testing his DNA would confirm his involvement in the crimes. However, there was a significant hurdle. Iran had no DNA on record because mandatory DNA testing for accused felons in New York wouldn't begin until the year 2000. In the 1990s, obtaining a DNA sample was not as straightforward as bringing a suspect and asking for a swab. DNA tests were still seen as invasive procedures, and acquiring a sample required judicial authorization based on reasonable suspicion. Even though there was substantial circumstantial evidence pointing towards Iran's involvement, detectives were aware that the details like the elevator ride, phone calls, and the laundry tag alone wouldn't be enough to persuade a judge to order Iran to provide a DNA sample. Consequently, the police had to resort to an alternative plan. Their initial approach involved tailing Iran Key, hoping he would unknowingly leave behind a sample of his saliva, like through spitting or disposing of chewing gum. However, this tactic quickly proved to be unsuccessful. On February 8, 1999, detectives finally caught a break when Iran was arrested for his involvement in the theft of a computer hard drive. Since there were no laws mandating DNA testing for arrested individuals in New York at that time, the police had to resort to a bit of trickery in an attempt to obtain a DNA sample. They devised a plan where a female detective disguised herself as a doctor. Wearing a white hospital garment, she approached Iran and asked him to provide a saliva sample for what she described as a routine tuberculosis test. She handed him paperwork in hopes he would sign a release form. However, Iran, being cautious, took the time to read the document. When he noticed a line mentioning DNA analysis, he refused to cooperate. He claimed that he was a practicing Jehovah's Witness and that his faith prohibited him from participating in any form of medical treatment. Aaron had figured out what the police were after, and he was determined not to give it to them. After finishing his meal that evening, he tore his paper cup into pieces and flushed them down the toilet. To further confuse investigators, he swapped his cup with that of his cellmate. However, the police were one step ahead. Shortly after Aaron's arrest, he had been in a shared holding cell with several other men. During their time there, attendants had provided them with cups of water. Detectives managed to locate these cups in a wastepaper basket and sent them for DNA testing. Within just a couple of days, the results came back, confirming that a sample collected from the rim of one of the cups found in the police holding cell matched the DNA of the East Harlem criminal. By the time the DNA test results were ready on February 12, 1999, Iran had already been released without bail, as he was only facing a misdemeanor charge related to computer theft. Meanwhile, the New York Police Department offered an $11,000 reward for any information that could lead to his arrest. Authorities soon discovered that Iran had traveled to Brownsville, Brooklyn, and met up with his 16-year-old girlfriend named Angelique Stalling. Her parents believed that they were going on a Valentine's Day date. However, instead of sticking to their plans, Iran and Angelique boarded a bus headed for Florida from Newark, New Jersey. Detectives grew concerned that Angelique might be in danger, potentially facing the same fate as the previous victims. After Iran arrived in South Florida, he made 2 phone calls to another girlfriend back in New York. By this time, news of his status as a suspected serial killer on the run had made headlines. The second girlfriend, aware of the situation, properly contacted the police and provided a tip that Iran was staying at the Miami Sun Hotel, located just 2 blocks from the beach on Northeast 1st Avenue in downtown Miami. Responding to this tip, 2 New York detectives rushed to the hotel and began surveilling it. When they spotted Iran and Angelique walking around inside, they called the Miami-Dade SWAT team for assistance. The SWAT team stormed the building and discovered Iran and Angelique hiding under the bed on the hotel's 6th floor. And on February 19, 1999, Iran was apprehended and placed in custody. When detectives attempted to interrogate Iran about the East Harlem crimes, he remained silent and did not provide any information. However, the police had a plan. They later observed and listened from behind a 2-way mirror as they allowed Angelique into the interview room. Iran and Angelique believed they were having a private moment to say their goodbyes. During this conversation, Angelique pressed Iran to explain why he had committed the crimes. Iran's response was cryptic. He mentioned that he had bugged out and claimed to have had a sickness. After a lengthy 4-month legal battle, Iran was eventually extradited to New York to face trial on 22 felony charges related to 4 assaults in the murders of Paula Olera, Joyce Casper, and Rashida Washington. DNA evidence connected Iran to 6 out of the 7 cases. During the trial in the fall of 2000, prosecutors John Irwin and Richard Plansky presented a powerful case. With a barrage of testimonies and DNA evidence against Iran, they called upon 130 prosecution witnesses, including 2 of Iran's victims. Iran himself insisted on being the first defense witness to take the stand. Over the course of 2 days of testimony, Iran displayed a range of emotions. From giggling like a schoolgirl to crying like a baby, he also expressed his anger at being prosecuted. His monologue, which was largely uninterrupted by the judge, prosecutors, or his own attorneys, covered a wide range of topics including pop culture, drugs, rap music, jail food, and his reflections on the criminal justice system. With many of his victims' family members present in the courtroom, Iran moved a bizarre narrative to explain why he found himself facing charges of brutal serial violence against young women. He asserted that the police had conspired to frame him as a part of a cover-up orchestrated by a corrupt medical examiner who was involved in harvesting and selling human organs. He even claimed that his DNA had been manipulated in what he referred to as genetic shuffling. However, the jury did not buy into his elaborate story. On December 16, 2000, when the guilty verdict was delivered, the courtroom burst into cheers. As Iran was later led past the crowd of grieving relatives, he directed a profane curse at them. During the sentencing a month later in January 2001, family members of Iran's victims had the opportunity to speak directly to him. Olga Paula's mother addressed him, expressing her wish that he would understand the torment of sleepless nights, loss of appetite, the inability to walk or breathe, and the absence of peace. All the while thinking about her daughter's suffering at the time of her death, Olga spoke of her enduring pain, having brought her daughter to the country in pursuit of the American dream. When it was Iran's turn to speak at the sentencing hearing, he began to cry and said that he was sorry. In response to this, a male cousin of Joyce Casper erupted in anger and attempted to leap over the barrier in an effort to attack Iran. Following this, Justice Joan Sodonic delivered the sentence. She imposed 3 life sentences on Iran, each without the possibility of parole for the 3 murders. Additionally, he received a 400-year sentence for 4 counts of abuse. Iran was incarcerated in the Clinton Correctional Facility located in Dannemora, New York. By the time Iran was sentenced, lawmakers in New York and many other states had enacted laws requiring DNA testing for individuals arrested in connection with violent crimes. Since then, this testing has been expanded to encompass most felony arrests spanning both violent and nonviolent offenses. Moreover, certain jurisdictions have initiated DNA testing for individuals arrested for misdemeanors. For Olga, the agony of losing Paula remains as raw as ever. She understands all too clearly that the anguish stemming from the sudden and senseless loss of a loved one doesn't fade with time, especially when so many unresolved questions linger. As we conclude this heart-wrenching journey through Paula's tragic story, her memory and that of the other victims lingers in our thoughts. Reflecting on Iran's actions and consequences he faced, we are left with thought-provoking questions. What drives an individual like Iran to commit crimes like this? And how can society identify and address the factors that lead to such behavior? Frank Batts was a United States Marine and a veteran of World War II. During his service, he was stationed for a time at Camp Pendleton in Southern California. After completing his military duty, Frank and his family settled in California, specifically in San Diego. He and his wife Elaine had 3 children, 1 son and 2 daughters. Frank often took his son John fishing on a barge anchored off the coast near Oceanside. Frank and Elaine opened a small store called Bott's Gift Shop in the College Grove Shopping Center. On the afternoon of Saturday, April 2nd, 1977, a customer entered Bott's gift shop but found no one there to assist them. When they walked to the back of the store, they discovered Frank's body in the store's office. He had been stabbed to death in what would later be classified as a robbery. At the time of his death, he was 61 years old. It would take 46 years and 5 labs in 2 states to finally solve Frank's murder. A renewed investigation into the case began in 2021. In the summer of that year, A match was found to a set of fingerprints collected from the glass counter at the gift shop when the scene was processed after Frank's murder. The technology required to adequately process these years-old fingerprint lifts had only been developed within the previous decade. Still, investigators hope to find more corroborating evidence. They therefore use multiple labs to look for and process DNA evidence. A hat, which investigators describe as distinctive, had been found in the office along with Frank's body. It did not belong to him, and police believed his killer had lost it in the struggle that had ended with Frank's murder. One of the labs working with the investigators from the San Diego District Attorney's Office ultimately developed technology that allowed them to pull a DNA sample from the hat and match it to an individual whose DNA was on file. The DNA profile from the hat matched a DNA profile later extracted from scrapings taken from Frank's fingernails at his autopsy. The DNA profile belonged to the same individual, identified in 2021, as having left their fingerprints at the scene. In May of 2023, the San Diego District Attorney's Office identified the person responsible for the murder of Frank Botts as Norman Lamont Jones. Jones had been just 16 years old at the time of Frank's murder, but he was already 2 years into his criminal career. He would go on to have an extensive criminal record and be in and out of jail until 1991, when he was killed in an officer-involved shooting after a robbery at a store in the Fashion Valley shopping mall. Frank's son, John, has expressed relief both at finally having resolution to his father's case and at knowing that his father's killer had not been able to hurt anyone else after 1991. Joyce Casper was a generous, vivacious woman and the mother of 2 daughters and a son. She was loved by her children as well as their friends. Joyce owned a drugstore and soda fountain in the Vista Village Shopping Center in Boise, Idaho. Her children's friends from the local junior high school would come in to have lunch there, and Joyce would dote on all of them. Decades later, they would still remember the affection she showed towards them and the attention she gave to them. By 1987, Joyce's soda fountain no longer existed, but 65-year-old Joyce still owned a business at the location on Vista Avenue. She was now the owner and operator of Casper's Vista Hallmark and Gift Shop. On the morning of October 13, 1987, Joyce's vehicle was found near some railroad tracks at Day Drive and Robert Street, just a few blocks away from her store. Her body was inside of the car. While evidence suggested to police that Joyce had been murdered, they could not determine the exact cause of her death. They were able to determine that she had been sexually assaulted. Joyce was known to be a hard worker who often kept very late hours at her shop. The doors to the store were locked when police went there after the discovery of her body. They believed she had been abducted outside of her shop as she left in the early morning hours of 13th. She was then sexually assaulted and killed, with her body being found a few hours later. Those who knew Joyce could not fathom that someone would want to hurt her, and those who lived and worked around her shop were shocked that such a violent crime could occur in their neighborhood. However, a recent incident had placed Joyce in danger. Just a few weeks before she was killed, Joyce called police to report that she had been attacked in her store. A young man, believed to be between the ages of 17 and 25 with slicked back, black hair, had attacked Joyce in her store but had run off when she fought back. Police were not able to identify this individual, but after Joyce was killed, they feared he may have been the person responsible for her murder. Joyce's purse had been emptied and one of her credit cards was missing. There were no security cameras in the area of her store or where Joyce and her car were ultimately found, and no witnesses could be located. Nearly 150 suspects were investigated in the following years. Semen was found at the scene, and eventually DNA was extracted from it. However, no match to it was ever located in criminal databases. The case was formally reopened in 2017 for the 30th anniversary of Joyce's murder. 2 investigators were assigned to work on her case full-time. They submitted the DNA from Joyce's crime scene to Parabon Nanolabs, who used it to generate an image of what the contributor of the DNA may have looked like. They found that the DNA profile was consistent with an individual who had dark hair and dark eyes and may have had Colombian or Puerto Rican ancestry. The image was released to the public, but no one called in to police, reporting that they recognized the man in the image. In 2019, what would ultimately be a years-long effort to use genetic genealogy to the case started working with another company, Identifiers International. An extensive family tree was developed and detectives looked into records of 100 of individuals trying to ascertain how they were related to Joyce's killer. They also collected DNA samples from numerous distant relatives of the killer, trying to figure out exactly where he would be situated within the family tree. Various social media sites and genealogical databases from all over the country were searched for leads. Investigators ultimately came into contact with a man who told them he had a half-brother who had lived in Idaho. They were able to get in contact with the half-brother's ex-wife in California. She had 2 sons with this man, but they were both homeless and difficult to contact. A detective did eventually find them in Los Angeles, and they provided samples of their DNA. Their DNA profiles confirmed that the DNA from the semen found at Joyce's crime scene belonged to their father. On July 7, 2023, the Boise Police Department announced that they had identified the individual they believed was responsible for Joyce Casper's murder as Frank A. Rodriguez. He had been just 17 years old at the time of Joyce's murder. Rodriguez could not be arrested or charged with the murder because he had taken his own life in 2007. Rodriguez's family cooperated with police, and his mother is still alive. Boise Police Detective Paul Jagosh likened informing her of the DNA match to a death notification based on how devastated she was to learn of what her son had done. The Boise Police Department is currently looking into the possibility that Rodriguez may have been involved in other unsolved cases. 26-year-old David Malcolm hailed from Connecticut and was living in Ithaca, New York while enrolled at Cornell University. According to Nina Miller, one of his co-workers, the sheer gentleness of the man made him very special. He also had a wonderful sense of humor. He was the best of what young people can be. He was idealistic, sensitive, warm, very bright. David has also been described by others as being wise beyond his years and a good role model. David dedicated much of his time to helping others. He worked at a Red Cross emergency shelter and at a suicide prevention network. On February 11, 1987, David worked a 24-hour shift at the Red Cross shelter, which was located on West Ford Street in Ithaca. On the morning of February 12th, his body was discovered in the shelter's office. He had been stabbed to death. Police initially suspected that David had been murdered by one of his co-workers and focused their investigation on this man for years. The case was investigated throughout 1987 and 1988 and then periodically up until 2010. The case was formally reopened in 2015 in hopes of using forensic science to solve it. The Ithaca Police Department worked with the New York State Police Troop C Major Crimes Unit, the New York State Police Forensic Identification Unit, the New York State Police Forensic Investigation Center, and the Tompkins County District Attorney's Office in the renewed effort. Following years of work, on May 26, 2023, the Ithaca Police Department announced that, based on DNA evidence and other investigative efforts, they had identified the individual they believed was responsible for the murder of David Malcolm. However, they are choosing not to reveal his name to the public because he cannot be charged with the murder. He died in 2019. The exact source of the DNA that tied him to the murder was also not disclosed. According to investigators, David was killed by the boyfriend of a young woman who had come into the shelter where David worked for help. On February 11, 1987, a teenage girl from the town of Newfield came to the shelter following an altercation with her boyfriend looking for assistance in being relocated somewhere away from him. Investigators believe that the deceased suspect came into the shelter looking for the young girl, and David refused to reveal where she was. According to the press release from the Ithaca Police, Mr. Malcolm's heroic actions for not disclosing the whereabouts of the young teen sadly cost him his life. Investigators from the Ithaca Police Department, Tompkins County District Attorney Matthew Van Houten, and Deputy Chief Vincent Monticello all met with David's family prior to the announcement that the case had been solved. They apologized for the fact that the case took 36 years to solve, attributing the family's long wait for answers to limited resources and the necessary technology being unavailable to them in 1987. On June 13, 1967, Gretchen Eleanor Harrington was born to Harold Boyd Harrington and Ina Harrington. At that time, her father Harold was a minister at a Presbyterian church. Along with her parents, Gretchen had 2 older sisters, Zoe and Harriet. Her family described her as someone who radiated kindness and possessed a sweet, gentle nature. By 1975, at the age of 8, Gretchen was in the 2nd grade at Delaware County Christian School in Newtown Square. Everything seemed to be going well for Gretchen and her family until a tragic event changed their lives. On the morning of August 15, 1975, Gretchen left home to attend a summer Bible camp program. This camp had 2 locations: the Trinity Church Chapel Christian Reformed Church, where a man named David Zanstra was the pastor, and the Reformed Presbyterian Church, where Gretchen's father, Harold, served as pastor. The Bible camp activities occurred in the morning at the first church, and afterward, David would transport the children to the second church. The Harrington and Zanstra families were well acquainted, living nearby and sharing the common bond of both fathers being pastors, while their mothers fulfilled the traditional roles of pastors' wives. Notably, one of Zanstra's daughters was Gretchen's best friend. That day, Gretchen's journey would take an unexpected turn. Typically, she would be walking to the summer Bible camp program with her 2 sisters, 12-year-old Zoe and 11-year-old Harriet. It was their daily routine. However, on that particular day, their mother Ina had just given birth to a baby named Jessica and was bringing the newborn home. Zoe and Harriet chose to stay back and await their return. Despite this change in routine, Harold, Gretchen's father, encouraged her to go to the summer Bible camp program to maintain her perfect attendance record, and so Gretchen embarked on the walk alone, as her father bid her farewell. It was just past 9 a.m. when she began her stroll up the hill towards Trinity. Harold kept a watchful eye on her as she proceeded along Lawrence Road. Little did he know that once she was out of his sight, it would mark the last time he would ever see his daughter alive. In the 1970s, in a peaceful suburban place like Marple, it was entirely normal to see children walking alone on sunny summer days. The idea of danger didn't even cross people's minds. This was a time when kids freely played until late in the evening. They roamed the streets, ventured into the woods, and even cooled off at Darby Creek, which flowed behind Gretchen's house, without any worries. Children would walk to their friends' houses, blocks away without any aid of cell phones or GPS watches to keep them connected to their parents. Marple was simply an exceptionally safe place. That's precisely why many longtime Philadelphians chose to move there in the 1960s. Gretchen was supposed to be at Trinity Chapel Christian Reformed Church by 9:30 a.m., but she didn't arrive as scheduled. The first inkling that something was amiss came when Harold noticed her absence around 11 a.m. A group of Gretchen's friends had come to the front door of their residence looking for her. Worried and unable to locate Gretchen within the classes or nearby, Harold took immediate action. He phoned the Trinity Chapel Christian Reformed Church and spoke with Maggie Zanstra, David's wife, in an attempt to determine his daughter's whereabouts. However, he was told she hadn't been seen. Following this, the Marple Township Police Department was contacted by David, and Gretchen was formally reported as missing. Gretchen's disappearance sent shock waves through Broomall in Marple Township. By the following day, August 16, 1975, an extensive search effort involving 100 of people was underway to find her. This included volunteer firefighters and K-9 units, who scoured both sides of the creek, fields, and wooded areas. A Pennsylvania State Police helicopter continuously scanned the area from above. However, on August 17, 1975, just 2 days after Gretchen went missing, the police had to call off the large-scale search operation because they had very little information to work with. The police chief, Daniel Hennessy, candidly admitted to a local newspaper that they had no clues regarding her whereabouts. This situation threw the entire town into a state of panic, shaking the community's sense of security to its core. In response, friends and family members started distributing flyers to passing motorists in the area. These flyers featured Gretchen's most recent school photo, showcasing her with a missing tooth and a cheerful childlike grin. The absence of information led to a surge in speculation and countless unanswered questions. Did she run away? Did she accidentally drown in the creek? Could a stranger have abducted her? Or was it someone she knew? The mystery surrounding Gretchen's disappearance left everyone deeply concerned and bewildered. In the days that followed after Gretchen vanished, the police worked to gather information and understand the events surrounding her disappearance. One of their key interviews took place on August 19th when they spoke with David. During this conversation, David disclosed that he had indeed transported a group of children to the church on the day Gretchen disappeared. However, he stated that he had not seen her on that particular day. As August turned into September, Gretchen's sisters, Zoe and Harriet Harrington, resumed attending Delaware County Christian School. However, their fellow students found it difficult to approach them or engage in conversation, unsure of what to say in the face of such a heart-wrenching situation. When traditional investigative methods yielded no results, the police decided to pursue an unconventional avenue in their search for Gretchen. They turned to the assistance of a psychic named Judith Richardson Hames. Judith was known for using her psychic abilities to aid law enforcement in solving nearly 100 criminal cases, particularly those involving missing children. In September 1975, Judith sat down with police officers and she made a prediction that she herself hoped would prove to be incorrect. According to her psychic insights, she believed that Gretchen was dead. A month later, on October 14, 1975, a jogger exploring Ridley Creek State Park stumbled upon a decaying body hidden in the forest. Initially unsure of what he had come across, his uncertainty vanished when he noticed a human fingernail. Recognizing the gravity of the situation, the jogger promptly contacted the police. Gretchen's parents examined the distinctive clothing discovered with the remains, and they confirmed it was hers. Subsequently, the medical examiner matched the body to Gretchen using dental records. The tragic conclusion was that Gretchen's death had resulted from homicide. The forensic examination revealed that her skull had sustained multiple fractures, indicating a severe beating. Although the police initially suspected abuse, the autopsy did not yield any concrete evidence to support this hypothesis. On Sunday, October 19, 1975, just a few days after Gretchen's body was discovered, her father, Harold, stood at the pulpit and delivered a deeply emotional sermon. In his heart-wrenching address, he spoke of Gretchen's faith in Christ. He pointed out that she was now free from this world, but her murderer remained bound by their terrible actions. Gretchen's funeral was a somber event, and David officiated the service for the 8-year-old. Following the ceremony, she was laid to rest in Meridian Line Cemetery, situated in Johannesburg, Michigan, USA. Meanwhile, the discovery of Gretchen's body in the woods ignited renewed fervor for the investigation. Witnesses began to step forward, sharing accounts of various individuals they had seen in the vicinity where Gretchen's body was found. These eyewitness reports provided descriptions of men who had been in the area. As a result, the police received a flood of tips from the community, with some seeming more promising than others, while others turned out to be unrelated or unhelpful in the pursuit of justice. Investigators examined a range of potential suspects, even scrutinizing individuals with prior criminal records residing in the vicinity. Despite their efforts, no significant leads emerged, and the evidence box stored at Marple Township Police Department headquarters began to gather dust. This box contained a trove of materials, including reel-to-reel tape interviews, photographs, and memoranda, all relevant to the case, but the lack of progress had it sitting idle. As time passed, the investigation into Gretchen's disappearance grew cold. Occasionally during roll call meetings, or when a detective had a spare moment in an otherwise uneventful week, they would revisit the case. They would look through the file, hoping to spot something they had missed before, but each time it seemed like a futile effort. The leads always led to dead ends, leaving them frustrated and without any breakthroughs in the case. For many decades, there were no developments in the case. The original detectives, who had been working on Gretchen's disappearance, had either passed away or retired. However, in the fall of 2022, there was a significant turn of events. A woman whose name was not released to the public reached out to the Marple Police Department, expressing her desire to discuss Gretchen's disappearance and murder. At the time, Nick Coffin, a sergeant, had taken charge of Gretchen's cold case. Therefore, when this woman contacted the Marple police, her message was directed to Coffin's phone. The woman informed Coffin that she believed she had information about who might have been responsible for Gretchen's tragic fate. She also mentioned an attempted kidnapping incident that had occurred around the same time, raising suspicions of a possible connection. This unexpected contact rekindled hope for solving the long-standing mystery surrounding Gretchen's disappearance and murder. On January 2, 2023, state troopers arranged an interview with the woman identified only by her initials, SF, denoting her as a confidential informant. This interview would prove to be a momentous breakthrough in a cold case that had remained unresolved for nearly 5 decades. According to SF, she had been a schoolmate of Gretchen and one of her sisters, Zoe. SF also disclosed to investigators that she had been friends with David Zanstra's daughters and frequently visited the Zanstra residence, even staying overnight on occasions. During one of these sleepovers, when she was 10 years old, Azaf recounted awakening in the middle of the night to find David inappropriately touching her. Brightened by this disturbing behavior, she shifted her position and prompted David to hastily exit the room. Shockingly, this inappropriate touching occurred again the following night. In the morning when the girls awoke, SF decided to confide in David's daughter about her father's unsettling actions. To her astonishment, the daughter responded with something along the lines of, "He does that sometimes." Over time, SF mustered the courage to share this distressing experience with her parents. Shortly after Gretchen's disappearance, the Zanstra family relocated to Plano, Texas, a suburb of Dallas, in response to the situation. During her interview, SF also shared with state police information about another child in their neighborhood, a girl named Holly, whom she considered a friend. According to her, someone had made an attempt to abduct Holly. As the conversation unfolded, SF presented the investigators with a diary she had kept during her childhood. In a specific diary entry dated September 15, 1975, she had written that a man had tried to kidnap Holly twice. In the diary, she went on to express her suspicion that this man, whom she referred to as Mr. Z, might be the one responsible for Gretchen's kidnapping. Mr. Z was her way of referring to David. This revelation from SF added a significant layer to the investigation into Gretchen's disappearance and murder. The interview with SF and her diary entry motivated investigators to locate 83-year-old David, who was now residing in Marietta, situated northwest of Atlanta, Georgia. On July 17, 2023, investigators conducted an interview with David at the Cobb County Police Headquarters in Marietta. This interview was carried out by 2 Pennsylvania troopers, Andrew Martin and Eugene Trey. The conversation started with a somewhat friendly tone. In the beginning, David initially denied having encountered Gretchen on the day she disappeared. However, the situation took a different turn when the police informed David about the allegations of assault made by a woman who had documented her experiences in the diary. As the conversation progressed, David eventually broke down and confessed to something profoundly disturbing. David recounted to the police that he had observed Gretchen walking towards the church that morning. He claimed that he offered her a ride in his green AMC Rambler station wagon, and she accepted, as she had no reason to decline the offer. However, contrary to taking her to church as promised, David admitted to investigators that he drove Gretchen to a nearby wooded area. There he parked the car and instructed Gretchen to undress, but she refused. Following this, he struck Gretchen with his fist, resulting in her suffering head injuries and bleeding. David then admitted that hearing Gretchen was dead, he tried to conceal her partially unclothed body with sticks before leaving the area. This shocking revelation left detectives stunned, as they processed the horrifying details of what David had confessed to. In the wake of the shocking revelation, David was arrested and faced a slew of serious charges, including criminal homicide and first-degree murder, as a result of his confession regarding Gretchen. While David's confession provided some closure concerning Gretchen's fate, it also raised a disconcerting question with ramifications that reached far and wide. Could this man, who had openly admitted to killing one girl and harming others, have additional victims? Before relocating to Marple, David had served as pastor at a now-closed church in Flanders, New Jersey for several years. During his time at Trinity, he had been an outspoken advocate against the inclusion of education about sexuality in the local school district's curriculum. Less than a year after the discovery of Gretchen's remains, he moved his family to a church in Plano, Texas, just outside Dallas, where he led the congregation for 7 years. Following this, David's pastoral journey took him to the Living Faith Community Church in San Diego. His final pastoral assignment was in Fairfield, California, from which he retired in 2005, at the age of 65. Authorities were aware that this lengthy period of leadership provided him with considerable influence and access to young and vulnerable individuals. This left them with questions about the potential extent of his actions during these years. The Marple community had at long last received some of the answers it sought for decades, but the shocking turn of events did not bring peace to many residents. It had been far more comforting to believe that an outsider, a disturbed criminal, had committed this heinous act. A person who randomly entered the town, abducted a young girl, and then vanished as swiftly as they arrived. However, the perpetrator was not an outsider, but rather a respected member of their own community. It was a religious leader, a man with a wife and young daughters of his own. This further shattered the sense of security within the community. In the aftermath of all this, Gretchen's family issued a statement. In it, they expressed their gratitude to law enforcement officials for their ongoing dedication to the case. They also conveyed their hope that the individual responsible for Gretchen's tragic murder would be held accountable. Following David's arrest, his legal team initially contested an extradition process. However, prosecutors led by Delaware County District Attorney Jack Stolsteiner sought assistance from Governor Josh Shapiro's office to facilitate the return of the confessed perpetrator to Pennsylvania. David is presently under investigation for potential instances of abuse beyond this case. Additionally, investigators took a DNA sample from David, which could prove valuable in a broader context, aiding in the investigation of other missing persons, as well as cases involving assault and murder nationwide. As we conclude this harrowing case, one can't help but reflect on the complexities and twists that unfolded over the years. What challenges lie ahead of Gretchen's family as they seek closure and healing after all these years? And what about David, the perpetrator? What kind of justice do you think he should face for his actions? And how will his arrest impact other potential cases of abuse? In 1930, the Maroney family in Chicago was facing a challenging situation. Michael and Catherine Maroney had two daughters, 2-year-old Mary Agnes and 11-month-old Anastasia, and were expecting a third child. The Great Depression had significantly impacted their lives, leaving Michael with only low-paying jobs. In an effort to find work, Michael published a letter in a local newspaper outlining their struggles. As a result of his letter, the Maroneys received some support. One man, Edgar Gilpin, visited their apartment, which was situated above a grocery store on Wentworth Avenue in Chicago, and brought Michael a suit and shoes. On May 14th, another visitor arrived, aiming to assist the Maroney children. A woman identifying herself as Julia Otis came to the apartment, stating that her social worker had sent her to see how she could help the family. She had obtained their address from the newspaper that published Michael's letter and arrived carrying fruits and vegetables she purchased from the grocery store below. While there, the woman became enchanted with Mary Agnes, expressing that she had always wished for a child just like her. The woman returned the following day, May 15, 1930, this time bringing a large bundle of clothing for the Maroney's unborn child. She offered to take Mary Agnes around the corner to buy clothing for her as well. Catherine agreed to let Mary Agnes go with her. The woman never returned with Mary Agnes. The Maroneys contacted the police and provided them with a general description of the woman, calling herself Julia Otis. She was approximately 5 feet 2 inches tall, 125 pounds, 22 years old, and smartly dressed in a gray suit and a gray lace hat. The day after Mary Agnes was taken, her parents received a letter wrapped around a $5 bill from Julia Otis. In the letter, she said that she was taking Mary Agnes to California, but would return her in a few months after Catherine gave birth and the family adjusted to having the new baby. She said she had hired a special nurse to help take care of Mary Agnes, and the little girl was being well taken care of. She promised to help the family get back on their feet and told Michael and Catherine not to worry about Mary Agnes. They, of course, did not follow this advice. Chicago police searched train stations and interviewed individuals who worked on board trains, looking for any indication that Mary Agnes had been transported out of town. They also traced the baby clothes Julia Otis had brought to the Maroneys to the Goldblatt's department store at Ashland and Chicago Avenues. The clothes had been paid for using a brand new $50 bill. The police also took Edgar Gilpin, the man who had donated clothing to Michael Maroney, into custody in case he had been involved in the plot to abduct Mary Agnes. Another letter came in the day after first, trying to explain the actions of Julia Otis. The letter was signed Alice Henderson and claimed to be from a cousin of Julia Otis. The letter claimed that Julia's husband had previously passed away and her child had recently died as well. The loss of her child had caused her to have a nervous breakdown. It again assured the Marones that their daughter would be returned to them in a few months. For days after Mary Agnes went missing, her parents were able to secure a warrant from a judge charging Julia Otis with Mary Agnes kidnapping. However, Julia Otis was not found to face these charges, and Mary Agnes Maroney was not found to be reunited with her family. The assurances of the two letters proved false, and Mary Agnes was never returned, no matter how many months passed. More than 20 years after Mary Agnes went missing, a Chicago newspaper claimed to have solved her case and reunited her with her parents. In 1952, the Chicago Daily News partnered with a newspaper in California where Mary Agnes was believed to have been taken based on the letter from Julia Otis. The Oakland Tribune published photographs of various members of the Maroney family, which were seen by a man who believed they all looked very similar to his wife, 24-year-old Mary Beck McClelland. Mary had been adopted the year Mary Agnes was kidnapped. The Chicago Daily News arranged for a variety of tests, which they claimed did not exclude Mary McClelland as possibly being Mary Agnes, although the value of these tests is questionable based on current scientific standards. These tests included the examination of dental casts taken from Mary McClelland, and members of the anthropologists claimed that genetic factors in teeth proved that Mary McClelland was in fact Mary Agnes Maroney. The paper arranged for Catherine Maroney to meet with Mary and declared the case solved on their front page. While the paper reported that Catherine believed Mary was her daughter for their story on what they claimed had been an emotional family reunion, the Marones did not believe that Mary was their daughter. Mary did not have a birthmark on her cheek as Mary Agnes did, or a scar Mary Agnes had as the result of a surgery to repair a herniated navel. After meeting Mary, Catherine said that she was a wonderful person, and while she wished Mary was her daughter, she was not. Mary did become a friend of the Maroney family and stayed in contact with them. The media coverage in California also brought another woman who thought she could be Mary Agnes into the Marones' life. She too became a family friend. In 2008, a DNA test conducted after Mary McClelland's death showed that she was not Mary Agnes. And 10 years later, DNA also proved that the other Maroney family friend was not Mary Agnes either. Catherine and Michael Maroney would go on to have a total of 8 children. Neither of them ever recovered from Mary Agnes kidnapping. Catherine fell into a deep depression and died in 1962 at just 49 years of age. Michael died at age 58, with his last words reportedly being, "They never found my baby girl." Michael and Catherine both made their other children promise to never give up looking for their sister until they found her. As the 100th anniversary of Mary Agnes kidnapping grew closer, cold cases were getting a lot of attention both nationwide and in Chicago specifically. In 2011, the office of Cook County Sheriff Tom Dart had undertaken a major investigation trying to identify John Does killed by John Wayne Gacy, successfully uncovering the identities of 3 of them in the next 10 years. In addition, the office's Missing Persons Project is working to solve cases of women who have been missing for more than 3 years, and used cases are listed in the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, or NAMUS. One of the investigators assigned to the unit was Detective Jose Rodriguez. On June 10, 2022, Detective Rodriguez was tasked with investigating Mary Agnes' disappearance. He turned to the technique that was being widely used nationwide and had been successfully used in the Gacy investigation, genetic genealogy. Detective Rodriguez reached out to members of the Maroney family and learned that several of Mary Agnes' relatives had profiles on commercial DNA sites like 23andMe and Ancestry.com. Some members of family had hoped that these sites would help them find Mary Agnes on their own. When they learned that Mary Agnes' case was being reopened and that their DNA could help, another relative submitted their DNA as well. Their results all ultimately revealed a second or third cousin that none of them knew. Detective Rodriguez was able to get in contact with this individual, a woman named Lori Hart. She, in turn, gave the contact information for her aunt, Terry Arnold, whose mother, Jeanette Burchard, was now being considered as potentially being Mary Agnes Maroney. Jeanette Damon spent the first 6 years of her life in Chicago, just 11 miles away from the Maroney family. She had been told that her date of birth was April 14, 1928, and that her father had died when she was just 2 months old. She was raised by her mother and later a stepfather. She was never abused, and, unlike many children growing up during the Great Depression, she never went hungry and always had anything she could possibly want. She was raised as a devout Catholic and received a good education. Her family moved to Virginia in 1934 and then to Florida during World War II. Sometime in 1940s, she married Edgar Jennings and had 3 children. She and her husband divorced in 1961, and she remarried to a man named Earl Thomas Burchard in 1977. Earl died in 1989. Jeanette worked as a nurse for more than 50 years and loved the opera, particularly Madame Butterfly. She was also a fan of the Miami Dolphins from the day the team was established in 1966. Jeanette was a devoted mother who loved all of her children dearly. She would later become a grandmother who was always there for her grandchildren. She was also very attached to her pets. She had all of her cats and dogs cremated, and their remains were buried with her when she passed away in 2003 at the age of 75. When detective contacted Jeanette's daughter, Terry, she was initially positive her mother could not be Mary Agnes Maroney. She could not imagine her grandmother being involved in a child abduction. She decided to take a commercial DNA test to prove the detective's theory wrong. However, when she received her results, they were not what she was expecting. While her mother's family was Polish, Terry's DNA showed that she did not have Polish ancestry. Rather, she was of Irish descent, like the Maroney family. Furthermore, the test identified Mary Agnes's nieces and nephews as her cousins. Terry's initial reaction was anger at her grandmother. It is still unclear how exactly Mary Agnes came into her custody and was raised as Jeanette. Previously, the family had no reason to believe Jeanette was not her mother's biological child. The only suspicious event in her life was an occasion when Jeanette's stepfather alluded to her not being her mother's natural child. He did not provide any other information. Jeanette contacted her cousins in Chicago to see if they had any information about this claim, but they had no idea why he would say this. Terry has been working through these complex emotions. She has been working through these complex emotions. She has been in contact with the Maroney family and is enjoying getting to know them. She has spoken to them several times over the phone and sent them photographs of her mother. She believes that had her mother been alive when the truth about her origins was revealed, she would have pursued a relationship with the Maroneys. She would have wanted to reassure them that she was alive and well and had lived a good life. Terry also believes that her mother would have loved being part of such a big family. While the DNA evidence seems to prove that Jeanette Burchard was Mary Agnes Maroney, the evidence is indirect. In order to prove this identification to an adequate legal standard, both Jeanette and Catherine Maroney's remains would need to be exhumed for direct DNA samples to be taken and compared. Terry Arnold told Detective Rodriguez from their earliest communications that she is not comfortable with an exhumation of her mother's remains. The missing person's remaining means of investigating how exactly Mary Agnes came to live with the woman who raised her as her daughter. Therefore, Mary Agnes' case does not fit the official criteria needed for it to be removed from NAMUS. Even after police announced that the investigation was closed on February 3, 2023, the case remained listed in the database as the oldest case from Illinois. As the Maroney family accepts that Mary Agnes lived out her life as Jeanette, they consider it solved and are no longer looking for her. Investigators were apparently ultimately successful using their acceptance as a means of getting the case removed from the database several months later. While Mary Agnes was never reunited with her family, the Marones feel that this resolution was still, in some ways, positive. Mary Agnes's nephew, Don Maroney, told the Chicago Sun-Times, "One of our hopes was that, when Mary Agnes was taken, that she led a good life and she was taken care of, and she was." One day in the summer of 1992, Bob Kopta returned to his home in Ross Township, Pennsylvania. But his wife of 20 years, 52-year-old Patricia, was not there as he had expected. It was not uncommon for her to leave home for short periods of time without telling anyone, but he ultimately reported her missing. In school, Patricia had been a straight-A student who worked as a model and a dance instructor. After graduating from high school, she continued dancing by attending weekly ballroom dancing events and took a job working in finance at a plate glass company in Pittsburgh. She met Bob Kopta near a river in Pittsburgh, and he offered to give her and the friends she was with a ride on his boat. Bob and Patricia fell in love and married in 1972. By the time she disappeared in 1992, Patricia's life had become far less idyllic than it once had been. She had resigned from her long-time job at the glass factory because she suffered from migraines, which her doctors told her were the result of stress. She then went to work as an elevator operator at the Art Institute of Pittsburgh. While she was employed there, her family began noticing concerning changes in her behavior. It was at the Art Institute where she claimed to have started receiving visions, saying she had seen an angel while she was there. Patricia then soon became a well-known street preacher in the area, dubbed the Sparrow because of her small build. She frequented parking lots and busy streets in Ross Township, as well as concert venues and stadiums in Pittsburgh, preaching to people as they walked or drove by. She preached about her religious visions and tried to warn people about the end of the world, which she believed to be imminent. Patricia was briefly institutionalized prior to her disappearance. Doctors at the facility diagnosed her as having delusions of grandeur and stated she was showing signs of schizophrenia. Patricia was afraid of being placed in an institution long-term, so when she went missing, police theorized that she had voluntarily disappeared to prevent this from happening. Patricia's family and the police tried every avenue of investigation open to them. They even went so far as to consult a psychic to try to find Patricia. However, they could not find any trace of her. After Patricia had been missing for 7 years, she was declared legally dead. More than 30 years later, Patricia's shocked surviving family members were present at a press conference on March 3, 2023, during which Ross Township Police Department Chief Brian Colehep announced that Patricia's disappearance had been solved. She had been found alive living in a nursing home in Puerto Rico. Patricia being in Puerto Rico made some level of sense to her family. She had previously vacationed there multiple times with friends before she got married and had talked about wanting to travel there again because she enjoyed the climate. Bob Kopta had even taken out newspaper advertisements about his wife's disappearance there in hopes that someone on the island had seen her, but he never received any information from the effort. While Patricia's location was logical enough to her family, they were still shocked to learn that she was still alive after 3 decades. Patricia's twin sister died without knowing what happened to Patricia, but Patricia's husband Bob and younger sister Gloria finally learned her surprising fate. Patricia had been in Puerto Rico since at least 1999, around the time she was declared legally dead back in Pennsylvania. She had been wandering around several towns in the northern part of the island. She was found living on the streets and identified as a person in need. This allowed her to be placed in a care home for adults. At the time, she would not reveal any details about her past or her identity. At one point, she hinted that a cruise ship from Europe had brought her to Puerto Rico. Patricia developed dementia years later, which led to her, perhaps inadvertently, revealing more details about her origins to her caregivers in passing. They were eventually able to piece together enough of the random pieces of information to find Patricia's case back in Pennsylvania. They contacted authorities there, and DNA samples provided by Patricia's sister and nephew confirmed that the woman in Puerto Rico, who now required more intensive care in a nursing home, was Patricia Kopta. Since Patricia was located, Bob Kopta has stated that he is relieved that his wife was not murdered or otherwise harmed. He is also happy that she is being taken care of so well in the nursing home. In the decades since Patricia disappeared, he would always fear that his wife had been killed and her body had been found any time he heard about police finding human remains on the news. He never remarried, even after Patricia was declared legally dead. However, he has no plans to visit Patricia in Puerto Rico. Patricia's sister, Gloria, does plan to travel to Puerto Rico to see her, even though she understands that Patricia will most likely have forgotten her due to her dementia. Whether she knows me or not, I still want to see her and give her a hug and tell her I love her. I thought maybe she had died, Gloria said at the press conference. 28-year-old Judith Bellow lived on Saratoga Drive in Stanwood, Washington with her husband and 3-year-old son. She was employed at the National Food Corporation in Savannah. It was at work where she was last seen on December 13, 1993. She left the facility at 9:30 that morning and was not seen again. She did not pick up her son from daycare and did not return to her home. Her car was later found abandoned at the post office in Stanwood. Police investigating her disappearance did not believe that she had left voluntarily because she would not leave her son behind, and she was very close with her siblings. They believed that she had most likely been the victim of foul play. Their investigation did not locate Judith or her body, and her case eventually went cold. Years later, Judith was featured as the Eight of Hearts in a deck of playing cards issued by the Snohomish County Sheriff's Department. Each card in the deck featured an individual who was the subject of an ongoing cold case investigation, including missing people and murder victims. The decks of cards were distributed throughout the community in hopes that someone with information about one of the cases would see them and call in a tip. A tip did later come in finally solving the case. However, it did not come from a witness. It came from Judith Bellow herself. On November 23, 2011, a woman claiming to be Judith called the Snohomish County Sheriff's Department and left a message stating that she was alive and living in California. In the following weeks, the Sheriff's Department investigated this claim and ultimately determined that the woman who contacted them was in fact Judith Bellow. According to Judith, she had voluntarily disappeared because of serious problems in her marriage. She had cut off contact with her family because she was afraid of her husband and feared her siblings would face harassment from him if they knew where she was. She left Washington State in August of 1994 and was living in California when she saw her case on the Sheriff's Department's website. Since she left Washington, she had given birth to 3 more sons. Judith was not the only relative her family had spent years looking for. 3 months after Judith disappeared, her husband had abruptly left town with his and Judith's son, cutting off contact with Judith's family. They did not hear from Judith's son until he was a teenager and chose to reach out to his mother's family on his own accord, contacting his maternal grandmother in Mexico shortly before she died. Judith's siblings were ecstatic to find her and to learn that they had 3 more nephews. Several of her brothers began making plans to go to California to spend Christmas with Judith and her sons once the Sheriff's Department put them in contact with her. 8-year-old Chad Joyce lay in bed, lost in dreams, when an intruder quietly entered the house and took him into the darkness of the night. Initially considered a runaway case due to the lack of evidence, the investigation quickly turned into a nightmare as the critical 48-hour window passed with no sign of Chad. Who could have had the ability to silently enter Chad's home and take him without a trace? However, the most pressing question remained. Would Chad ever reunite with his family and return home? The city of Tyler, named after the 10th President of the United States, John Tyler, is the largest city in northeastern Texas. Often referred to as the Rose Capital or Rose City, Tyler earned its reputation due to its extensive history of rose production, cultivation, and processing. Each October, the city welcomes thousands of tourists. However, the October of 1991 took a dark turn, as Chad Joyce mysteriously vanished without a trace, casting a shadow over the usually vibrant atmosphere. Ernest Chadwick Joyce, known affectionately as Chad Joyce, came into the world on April 26, 1983 in Texas. He was one of the cherished 4 children in the Joyce household, a beautiful soul deeply adored by his family, particularly his mother, Karen Elaine Joyce. Chad was an outgoing youngster, surrounded by a large circle of friends with whom he frequently played. Moreover, his strong bond and affectionate relationship with his siblings were apparent, as they often enjoyed quality time together. Chad's energetic and lively nature was further evident in his regular visits to the playground. Chad had an older sister named Angela Joyce, who fondly recalls that her little brother had a passion for riding bikes, scaling trees, and indulging in sports. Details about the remaining siblings were not made public. As a student at Mommy G. Griffin Elementary School, Chad's life was in its budding stage. At just 8 years old, he had his entire future ahead of him. However, fate often takes unforeseen turns, and tragically, Chad's destiny had already been sealed. The daily routine of the Joyce family was shattered on the morning of October 31, 1991. On the fateful morning, Chad's mother, Karen, rose early and went to the church without waking her children, allowing them to continue sleeping. However, just a few minutes into her church service, Karen received a phone call. Karen rushed back home and began scouring the neighborhood for Chad. She sought assistance from her neighbors as well. Despite their collective efforts and their thorough search, Chad seemed to have vanished without a trace. It was as though he had disappeared into thin air. Now it was the police's turn to investigate the matter. Karen dialed 711, reaching the Tyler police station, where Sergeant Bill Gokane responded and arrived at their house shortly after the call. During his initial inspection, he looked for signs of a break-in, but there were no indication of forced entry. Moreover, there were no signs of struggle inside the house. Based on the initial investigation, Gokane began to consider the possibility that Chad might have run away from home. However, Karen firmly believed that her son had been kidnapped. And as the sun set and the day turned into a chilly night, her tension escalated into fear. Adding to her fear, the crucial 48-hour window had passed without any signs of him. Later during the interview, Chad's older sister Angela Choice provided a crucial piece of information to the detective. Her house keys had disappeared the day before, and she distinctly recalled leaving them by the back door of the residence. This revelation raised additional questions, suggesting the possibility of a planned kidnapping or something even more disturbing. 2 days after Chad's disappearance, a ransom note was discovered at the business of Chad's uncle, Greg Sterling, prompting the investigation to swiftly shift focus to a kidnapping scenario. As the family attempted to deliver the money at the Greyhound bus station, as instructed, the kidnapper failed to appear. Several days later, Chad's mother received an anonymous phone call, revealing that Chad's disappearance was leaked to a family member's drug debt, with a man named Paco. Investigators discovered that Greg Sterling owed money to 3 Colombian drug dealers in the area, Paco Jr. and Carlos, shedding light on a possible motive of Chad's abduction. However, the case still remained elusive. On the 1-year anniversary of Chad's disappearance, his mother Karen Choice discovered a note fluttering on her car windshield. The note asserted that Chad was still alive and demanded $6,000 for his safe return. This development reignited the investigation, filling the Choice family with hope and prayers of seeing Chad again. However, the case suffered a setback when the kidnapper failed to make contact once more, causing the investigation to stall again. Time was not on their side. Slowly, years were passing by, and Chad Choice's disappearance gradually evolved into a cold case. 4 years later, in October 1995, a grocery sack appeared on the Chase family's doorstep. Initially, it seemed like a regular grocery sack. However, upon opening, it revealed something that would haunt Karen Choice for the rest of her life. Inside the package was a human skull. The skull was subsequently sent to the FBI for analysis. DNA samples from Choice's family were collected to compare with the skull's DNA, to confirm its identity as Chad's. Despite these efforts, the results remained inconclusive. Later, the skull was sent to a university in Texas for further examination, involving the expertise of forensic anthropology. The results came back, and unfortunately Karen's worst fears were confirmed, when forensic analysis revealed that the skull indeed belonged to Chad. Investigators grappled with the ruthless nature of a person who not only commits a crime, but continues to torment the victim's family for years. Despite the struggle to comprehend this, Karen, all along, had an unshakable feeling in her heart that she would never see Chad alive again. All she could do now was pray for justice. While Chad Choice's case grew increasingly difficult to solve, another narrative unfolded in Smith County Jail in early 1996. A man named Patrick Horn was slated to be sentenced in federal court for credit union robberies and carjacking charges. He was also charged with the murder of J.C. Levasseur, a fruit stand owner. It became evident that he was destined to spend the rest of his life behind bars or even face a potential death sentence. However, this man we are discussing was soon to become the center of Chad's murder case. It occurred when he mentioned the name Chad Choice to the police during his time behind the bars. While this might have been a part of a deal to reduce his prison sentence, to the investigators it marked the first significant breakthrough they had made in the case so far. Horn was a resident in the Joyce family's neighborhood and was friends with them. During his interview regarding Chad's case, Horn informed investigators that he knew the identity of Chad's killer. As per Horn's account, Chad was murdered by two local drug dealers, both Colombian nationals, who were known by the street names Paco and Carlos. But the case was just about to get more twisted. After Horn made the statement, he received a package in his jail cell containing a small boy's leg bone, later confirmed through analysis to be Chad's. Horn asserted to the police that Paco and Carlos had sent the package. However, detectives couldn't shake the feeling that Horn was hiding something significant about the entire story. Despite repeated questioning by the detectives, Horn consistently maintained that he had no additional information apart from Paco and Carlos being the culprits. However, on May 31st, 1996, Horn finally disclosed something more. Horn then revealed the precise location where Chad was buried. Shortly afterward, he was escorted by the police to 401 Sunnyside in Tyler, which was Horn's own backyard. At 4 p.m. that same day, the detectives began digging and discovered Chad's skeletal remains, along with 38 caliber shell casings. This moment marked a sudden turn in the investigation. With the evidence before them, all suspicions now pointed directly at Patrick Horn. Without delay, in June 1996, the investigators hurried to Athens, a city in Texas. In a jail cell there, a man sat who was anticipated to be a crucial piece of the puzzle, important in solving the case once and for all. This man was none other than Patrick Horn's brother, Keaton Horn, who was facing charges of probation violation. The detectives' suspicions were completely on point this time. With Keaton's statement, this case solidified into concrete evidence that Horn was indeed responsible for this notorious crime. Horn's scheme to mislead investigators had ultimately unraveled. The solution to a seemingly unsolvable case was finally in hand. However, one question still lingered. Why did Horn kill Chad? On September 24, 1999, 8 years after Chad Joyce's murder, the jury found Horn guilty in the Smith County Courthouse and sentenced him to death. However, even at the end of his chapter, Horn witnessed tormenting the Joyce household. Horn adamantly refused to sign the waiver allowing Chad's remains to be released to his family for a proper burial. Legally, he was required to agree to the release since the remains were evidence in his case. However, he insisted on retaining control over the fate of the 8-year-old Chad's remains. Horn did initially sign a waiver, indicating his agreement to the release of Chad Joyce's remains. However, the document was somehow lost between his attorney's office and the judge's office. At first deemed a mere formality, District Judge Diane DiVizzato announced in a December 1999 hearing that she would order the release of 30 exhibits, including Chad's skull and other bones to his family for burial, contingent upon Horn signing another waiver. Horn's appellate lawyer, Tony Wilkinson of Greenville, sent the document to Horn via Federal Express, anticipating its return with his signature within a day. However, a month passed without any response from Horn. He did not reply to several letters from his attorney and ignored messages sent to him through officials at the Atlanta Federal Prison. Assistant District Attorney Ed Marty stated that if the remains were granted without the waiver, they might have to be exhumed sometime in the future. It remains uncertain when Horn eventually signed the waiver, and if he did, when he signed it. Furthermore, Horn was 17 years old when he committed the murder of Chad. According to a ruling by the United States Supreme Court, anyone under the age of 18 cannot be executed. As a result, his sentence was commuted to life in prison. While this might not have been the exact form of justice Karen Joyce desired, she can finally find solace in knowing that Patrick Horn will never walk free. As the final chapter in the Chad Joyce case concludes, there remains a haunting mystery that continues to trouble both investigators and Chad's grieving family. Why did Patrick Horn go to such lengths? Kidnapping Chad Joyce, refusing the ransom, and ultimately taking his life? What could have motivated such a horrifying act? And do you believe the mother who lost her beloved child will ever find peace again? Silk Air Flight 185 took off from Jakarta, Indonesia, on December 19, 1997, for what was intended to be an 80-minute journey to Singapore. The flight was piloted by Captain Su Wei Ming, 41, and First Officer Duncan Ward, 23. The first half hour was uneventful, with calm weather and normal communications between the pilots and air traffic controllers. However, everything changed 35 minutes after takeoff when the flight abruptly banked sharply to the right and began a rapid descent from its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. The plane crashed into the Musi River in Sumatra less than a minute later, approximately halfway between Jakarta and Singapore. Local residents who witnessed the crash rushed into boats to search for survivors, but found only small pieces of debris. When Indonesia's National Transportation Safety Committee, NTSC, arrived, they confirmed the tragic reality. All 104 people on board, including 90 passengers and 7 crew members, had perished. Because the Boeing 737 was manufactured in the United States, the U.S. National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, became involved in the investigation. The NTSB had considerable experience in investigating 737 crashes and in underwater salvage operations, which proved crucial. The Musi River's murky waters, composed of deep clay and mud, severely hampered visibility and made recovering the wreckage nearly impossible. Investigators would eventually find that, in the final seconds before the crash, Silk Air 185 was traveling faster than the speed of sound. The force of the impact caused debris to be driven as deep as 15 feet into the thick mud. This presented the first significant challenge for the investigation: the absence of a debris field. Normally, crash investigators analyze the scattering pattern of debris to assess the plane's state at impact and determine if any parts had detached before it hit the ground. For instance, a small, contained debris field might indicate that the plane disintegrated on impact, while a larger spread would suggest it had broken apart in the air. Even in water crashes, investigators typically can map a debris field using floating components, like seat cushions. However, the mud and clay at the river's bottom were so dense that they submerged most of these buoyant objects. This caused a great delay in the mapping of the crash site, which would normally be available to investigators very early on in the investigation. As with any investigation, the most important items to recover from the crash site were the 2 so-called black boxes: the cockpit voice recorder, CVR, and the flight data recorder, FDR. The CVR records all noises made inside the cockpit, allowing investigators to hear not only what the pilots were saying during the flight and the eventual crash, but also how many and what kind of alarms may have been going off before impact. The FDR provides more technical data about how the plane and all of its systems had been functioning. Humongous cranes were brought in to dredge the bottom of the river for debris and hopefully locate the 2 recorders. Understanding the exact nature of Flight 185's sudden dive was of vital importance in determining what component of the plane had evidence from the FDR. Investigators used Indonesian air traffic control data to track Flight 185's flight path and calculate the plane's speed. Planes no longer appear on radar returns when they go below 20,000 feet above ground. As such, investigators only had Flight 185's descent from 35,000 feet to 20,000 feet to examine. Even with this narrowed window, Flight 185's rate of descent was calculated as approximately 30,000 feet per minute. Terrifyingly, the maximum rate of descent for a 737 is normally 7,000 feet per minute. This gross anomaly provided the first major break in the investigation, but also served as a grave reminder of just how terrifying the final seconds on board the plane must have been for the passengers and crew. The first major pieces of the plane to be recovered were actually found outside of the massive search area in the river, about 2.5 miles east of the crash site deep in the Sumatran rainforest. Investigators found the horizontal stabilizer from Flight 185. Horizontal stabilizers are used to control the pitch of an airplane and are found in its back tail section. The distance from which the horizontal stabilizer fell from the rest of the plane indicated that it came off during the flight. Flight 185 had been flying during good weather, and there were no obvious conditions that would have minimized the pilot's visibility. The investigators' initial theory of the crash was that there had been some sort of catastrophic mechanical failure on the plane. This theory made quickly discovering the cause of the crash of Flight 185 of utmost importance. In 1997, the Boeing 737 was one of the most widely flown commercial airliners in the world. 5 new 737s came into service every month. Flight 185 had in fact been Silkair's newest 737, only been in service for 10 months. If a mechanical flaw inherent in the design of the 737 caused the crash of Flight 185, thousands of lives around the world were in danger every single day. These fears about the safety of the Boeing 737 received added merit from the model's troubled past. The 737 had been involved in several incidents of rudder hard-over. Rudder hard-over occurs when a plane's rudder, which controls the direction in which the plane's nose is turned, becomes jammed to one side and cannot be controlled by the pilot. By the time of the Silkair crash, the NTSB had officially attributed the crashes of two 737s, resulting in the combined loss of 157 lives to rudder hard-over, and suspected that it played a part in at least two other incidents, which thankfully did not result in any loss of life. The separation of the tail section of Flight 185 would have been consistent with an occurrence of rudder hard-over. This possibility raised serious alarm bells for investigators. Boeing had engineered a fix for this problem before the construction of the plane that would eventually serve as Silkair Flight 185 even began. If this crash had been caused by rudder hard-over, then the perceived fix for the problem was in fact no fix at all, and thousands of modified 737s were still prone to rudder hard-over. As a result, closely inspecting Flight 185's Power Control Unit, PCU, the piece of the plane that Boeing had modified to correct the 737's rudder hard-over problem, became vital to the investigation. Fortunately, the PCU was one of the pieces of the plane that could be recovered from the crash site. The PCU as a whole and the servo valve within it that had failed in two previous fatal 737 crashes were available for examination. They were inspected for corrosion, but none was found. Everyone who examined the component found it to be in working order, and rudder hard-over was ruled out as a cause of the crash. Investigators now attributed the plane's tail ripping off of the back of the plane to its rapid and violent descent and not to a mechanical failure in the tail itself. While this was good news for Boeing and for 737 passengers around the globe, it left the team working on the Flight 185 case, still without an explanation for the crash. On the fifth day of the investigation, Christmas Eve of 1997, investigators, somewhat miraculously, located the flight data recorder of Flight 185. In an even more seemingly impossible stroke of luck, the cockpit voice recorder was found in the new year on the very last day the river was being searched. It was buried under 27 feet of mud. Both black boxes appeared to be in usable condition. However, because Indonesia did not have a laboratory capable of analyzing the data on them, the recorders had to be sent to NTSB headquarters in Washington, D.C., creating another delay in the investigation. When the data from the recorders was finally analyzed, 3 weeks after the crash, it raised more questions than it answered. The FDR had somehow stopped recording while the plane was still in the air. Data was available for the first 34 minutes and 14 seconds of the flight, and it all fell within the expected ranges. After that, there was no data whatsoever. Since the recorder cut off roughly a minute before Flight 185's sudden descent, investigators could not blame the dive for the stopping of the recording. Whatever caused the tape to cut off happened before whatever caused the plane to crash. This left the investigative team with one more question it needed the recordings from the CVR to solve. Furthermore, with the loss of the final minutes of FDR data, the CVR was the only means investigators had of gaining insight into the last moments the plane was in the air and what was happening on board Flight 185 during its final terrifying descent. This loss of information posed a major problem for investigators, but the absence of the recordings itself will become a major clue in piecing together the final minutes of the flight later on in the investigation. Unfortunately, the CVR data was just as puzzling as the FDR data. The first 34 minutes of the recording contained nothing but normal communications, such as the captain's welcome to the passengers over the intercom and the standard checks the captain and the first officer would have gone over together. Neither pilot made any mention of anything unusual happening. Then, like the FDR, the CVR abruptly stopped recording. This was puzzling enough on its own, but the CVR also stopped recording almost 6 minutes before the FDR did, meaning there had most likely been two different causes for the two devices ceasing their recording. Because they are built to withstand a plane crash, black boxes are designed to be very durable and dependable. Any kind of power failure that would cause them to stop recording is exceptionally uncommon. There was also no indication that there had been anything wrong with the plane's electrical system, and such a flaw would not have explained the delay between the two units failing, as they were on two different circuits. The odds that both units would independently fail, much less right before the plane crashed, were almost too minute to be considered. Investigators began experimenting in a test plane to see if some sort of overload could have shorted the circuit and what effects it would have had on the devices. They discovered that it was possible to overload the circuit, but they also discovered that doing so resulted in a loud sound as the breaker popped. This sound was the last noise on the recording from the CVR on the test plane. However, the sound could not be heard on Flight 1805 CVR. With the investigators' possible causes for the failure of the boxes becoming increasingly more limited and simultaneously more disturbing, they ran one more scenario in the test plane, pulling the circuit manually. Doing so did not cause any noise on the recording. Having ruled out a physical cause for the failure of Flight 185's black boxes, investigators began looking into the unsettling reason why someone in the cockpit would disable the recorders. Lacking data about the plane's performance during its final minutes of flight from the FDR, investigators turned back to alternative sources of information. The radar data was used in a series of test flights in a simulator to determine what exact set of circumstances would result in Flight 185's descent from 35,000 feet to 20,000 feet on the specific path shown by radar returns. They tested over 20 different scenarios, including various mechanical failures, trying to match the path taken by Flight 185. None of the scenarios, including the initially suspected rudder hard-over, fell within the parameters in the radar return data. The only way to get the simulated 737 to drop as steeply and as quickly as Flight 185 did was by having the pilot accelerate and continuously bank the plane sharply to the right. The only explanation for the accident was that it wasn't an accident, but an intentional maneuver made by one of the two pilots. Before going public with a horrifying theory, investigators began looking for physical evidence to support their version of events. The key piece in confirming that the plane had been in a commanded dive was its jack screw. A jack screw is a part located in the horizontal stabilizer of a plane that rotates when pilots push a switch on their control column. This turning moves the horizontal stabilizer up and down, changing the pitch of the plane. The NTSB was able to calculate the final pitch angle of the stabilizer based on the last setting of the recovered jack screw. The calculations confirmed that the horizontal stabilizer had not been in the expected cruising position. It had instead been in the nose-down position. The logical but horrible conclusion was that one of Flight 185's pilots intentionally crashed the plane into the river. According to the CVR, First Officer Duncan Ward had been alone in the cockpit shortly before the crash. Captain Su Wei Ming is heard asking his first officer if he would like some water and telling him that he is heading back into the cabin. The last sound the CVR captured was, rather than the popping noise of the CVR circuit as investigators had been looking for earlier, the sound of the captain's harness buckle clanging against the bottom of his chair as he stood up to leave the cockpit. In Indonesian flight traffic controllers confirmed that it was Ward they spoke to when they checked in 2 minutes before the plane began its fatal dive. However, with these final minutes unaccounted for by the CVR, investigators still had to work to determine who had been at the controls of the plane at the time of the crash. At this point, the investigation turned mainly towards the two pilots and their personal lives, trying to discern any reason as to why either of them would kill not only themselves but also 103 other people. Interviews with Silk Air staff showed that New Zealand-born First Officer Duncan Ward was generally well-liked and easy to work with. He had no debts, no troubled romantic relationships, and no history of any sort of mental illness. Initially, there was some suspicion that the pressures of living and working so far away from his home country and his entire family may have caused psychological problems for Ward, but his family members insisted that this was not the case. According to them, Duncan had loved flying since he was a teenager and considered himself very lucky to have the opportunity on paper. Captain Su Wei Ming similarly seemed to have plenty to live for and no motive to sabotage the flight. He was married and the father of 3 young boys and, as a former Air Force pilot, had risen through the ranks at Silk Air quickly. However, interviews with other pilots revealed that Captain Su had a reputation for often being willing to cut corners and take chances in order to decrease his flight times. 6 months before his death, He had been investigated by the airline because of a sharp landing he had made at an unsafe speed. The landing had been so violent that many of the passengers on board had gotten sick because of it. Captain Sue had been demoted from an instructor captain to a regular captain as a result of the investigation. Looking further back into Captain Sue's history as a pilot revealed a troubling coincidence. Silk Air, Flight 185, had crashed on December 19, 1997. On December 19, 1979, Su Wei-ming, then an Air Force pilot, took off for a training mission with 3 other fighter pilots. A mechanical problem with his jet caused him to have to turn around and return to base during the course of the mission. His 3 squadron mates continued on without him. All 3 died when their planes hit a mountain obstructed from their view by clouds. At least 2 of the other pilots were believed to have been close friends of Captain Sue. Such a heavy loss and a potential case of survivor's guilt would have potentially made the date of December 19th highly emotionally charged for the captain. Su Wei-ming's finances also turned out to be a source of pressure at the time of the crash. He had lost over $1 million in the past 4 years through high-risk online securities exchanging. He had so many outstanding debts that his trading privileges in the Singapore stock market had been suspended at the time of the crash. On the morning of the crash, he had pledged to repay his large debts as soon as he returned to Singapore. Investigators suddenly had a mountain of motives for Captain Sue to want to not only end his life but also to damage the reputation of Silk Air. However, just because Captain Sue had a motive to crash the plane did not mean he actually did. The last known person to be in the cockpit before the crash was First Officer Ward. Furthermore, he had been alone, which would have given him the opportunity to crash the plane. However, these circumstances, in fact, seemed to exonerate him from suspicion. The cockpit voice recorder is on the captain's side of the cockpit in a 737. When Captain Sue left the cockpit, his hand would have been within inches of it. He could have easily pulled the circuit to stop the CVR from recording without his first officer noticing. If First Officer Ward had been the one to pull the circuit, the CVR would have recorded the sounds of him unbuckling his harness and getting up to go over to where he could reach it. As such, it is most likely that Captain Sue pulled the circuit as he left the cockpit as heard at the end of the CVR's recording. It is hard to imagine why the captain would want the CVR to stop recording unless he planned to do something that he would not want there to be a record of, like crash the plane. It is impossible to know exactly what happened in the final minutes of Flight 185. However, the circumstantial evidence leads investigators to believe that after First Officer Ward completed his last radio call, Captain Sue re-entered the cockpit. He made up a reason to send First Officer Ward into the cabin. Maybe he told him a flight attendant asked to see him, or perhaps he ordered him to take a final break before they needed to plan for landing. After the first officer left, Captain Sue would have locked the door. Pulling the circuit to the FDR, unlike the CVR, causes a loud master alarm. Captain Sue, by disarming the CVR, had shown that he was actively trying to prevent there being any record of what he planned to do. As such, he would have had to disarm the FDR as well. He had to have locked the door so as to prevent First Officer Ward from rushing back into the cockpit and potentially stopping him from crashing the plane when he heard the loud alarm. Captain Sue would have had to use all of his strength to push on the control column enough to cause the sharp descent recorded by the radar data, and he would not have been able to accomplish it while fighting off his first officer. Without the CVR, it is impossible to know if Ward tried to re-enter the cockpit to help when he heard the alarm, or if he had realized what was going on when he found the door to be locked. Since Captain Sue sent the plane into its final dive less than a minute after disarming the FDR, it is possible that Ward did not even have a chance to make it back to the door and try to re-enter the cockpit. It is probable, however, that First Officer Ward was standing at the time. Being unsecured by a seat belt or a harness, he would have likely been slammed into the ceiling of the cabin when the plane began its sharp bank. First Officer Ward could very well have been deceased or unconscious within seconds of the beginning of the plane's descent, unable to do anything to try to prevent it. Indonesia's NTSC released its report about Flight 185 3 years after the crash. Shockingly, the formal report disregarded the evidence presented by investigators and announced that no cause of the crash was discovered. The report claimed that there was insufficient evidence to determine a cause for the accident because the final minutes of the flight were not recorded. The NTSB publicly report cited a deliberate act on the part of Su Wei-ming as the cause of the crash and detailed the evidence with which that determination was reached, challenging both the notion that the cause of the accident was unknown and that there was insufficient evidence to reach a conclusion that the plane. There are obvious biases that could be influencing these differing opinions. The NTSC, publicly blaming a pilot flying out of their country's main airport for bringing down a plane, could have potentially damaged customer confidence in commercial air travel. The airport Flight 185 had taken off from a lone serviced over 18 million passengers a year at the time of the crash. The NTSC had an obvious motive to try to protect the large and rapidly expanding Indonesian air travel industry. Similarly, the NTSB had motive to protect Boeing, the makers of the 737, from civil lawsuits and the loss of its strong reputation. Allegations that the NTSB report was fabricated to protect the company persist to this day. Boeing was and still is one of the largest manufacturers of commercial airliners in the world and also had and has large aerospace and defense operations, including numerous contracts with the United States government. In 1997, the year of the Flight 185 crash, Boeing employed almost 250,000 million people and generated almost $46 billion in revenue. The company had weathered the crisis of the two US 737 crashes because it had corrected the problem with the model servo valve once it was discovered. If Boeing had incorrectly addressed this problem, the impact on its reputation and therefore its sales could have been catastrophic, since that could lead to the loss of 1,000 of American jobs and severely damage the US economy. The NTSB could have been biased against blaming the crash on a mechanical failure. Both agencies had serious economic and governmental pressures on the results they reported. Despite the conflicting reports issued by their government agencies, both American and Indonesian members of the team that actually investigated the crash take the available evidence to mean that Flight 185 was brought down by an intentional command, most likely by Captain Su Wei-ming. Furthermore, the NTSB report was authored by Greg Fife, who had been directly involved with the investigation and had personally dealt with the evidence. The NTSC report, on the other hand, had been released by the head of the committee, who would have been more aware of and concerned with the political and economic consequences of the committee's ruling. On top of the two conflicting conclusions about the cause of the crash presented by the two government agencies that were in charge of the investigation, blame was assigned to another party in 2004. A jury in a Los Angeles Superior Court concluded that the servo valve in the PCU was what brought down the plane. They ordered Parker Hannifin, the manufacturer of the PCU, to pay the three families who had brought the suit $43,600,000. The servo valve had been suspected early in the investigation into the crash of Flight 185 because problems with it had resulted in two previous 737 crashes. The NTSC, NTSB, and Parker Hannifin had all examined the servo valve and surrounding PCU and found it to be in working order. Evidence collected by the NTSB and the report it issued evaluating it were not allowed into evidence in the Los Angeles case. As such, jurors did not hear about the conclusion that Flight 185 was brought down intentionally, nor did they have access to the majority of the evidence available about Flight 185 because it was collected as part of the official investigation. Lacking the majority of the information about Flight 185's crash, the main source of information in the trial was testimony from a metals expert hired as part of a private investigation for the lawsuit. The expert presented photographs from a scanning electron microscope showing chips in the servo valve of the PCU recovered Flight 185. This expert also testified that these microscopic chips could have interfered with the operation of the plane's rudder, leading to rudder hardover and the crash. However, it is impossible. It initially announced that it would appeal the Los Angeles verdict. However, they eventually decided to settle out of court and pay an unspecified amount of money to each family involved in the crash. They did not, however, ever accept any liability for the crash of Flight 185. In addition to the settlement from Parker Hannifin, each victim's family received $100,000 from Silk Air and an undisclosed amount of compensation from Boeing. Because the NTSC report did not implicate Su Wei-ming in the crash, his family received the entirety of his death benefits. The cause of the crash of Silk Air 185 will probably always be a source of controversy. However, the evidence collected during the investigation most comprehensively points to the loss of the plane and all those on board as being a result of Captain Su Wei-ming intentionally piloting the plane into the Musi River. While the NTSB's evidence for its version of events is circumstantial, it is overwhelming. Rosemary Pacenta was born on July 28, 1932. While not much is known about her early life, it is clear that she never married. For most of her life, Rosemary was the type of woman who kept to herself and minded her own business. In 1972, she moved to 140 Alcott Place, an apartment in Co-op City in the Bronx. For the next 25 years, she lived there alone and worked as a school teacher. Though her life was somewhat routine, she often ventured out to spend time with a few neighbors she had befriended in the building. On Sunday, January 5, 1997, the weather was particularly cold in the Bronx, prompting Rosemary to stay indoors. The night passed, and on Monday morning, January 6, 1997, she failed to show up at her school. Her phone rang multiple times, breaking the silence in her apartment, but there was no response. One of Rosemary's neighbors began to notice something was amiss. The lights in Rosemary's apartment had stayed on through the night. However, she didn't put much thought into it. But when she tried calling Rosemary and got no answer throughout the day, she grew concerned. And then in the evening at 6:15 p.m., the neighbor decided to check up on Rosemary and went to her apartment. From the moment she arrived at Rosemary's apartment door, she had an eerie feeling. The door to the apartment had been left slightly open. She walked in slowly, taking small steps, afraid of what she might find. The neighbor's worst fears came true as soon as she walked into the kitchen and discovered Rosemary's body in a pool of blood. She shrieked, looking at the gruesome scene, and tried to pull herself together. She informed the authorities immediately, and soon Detective George Wood and Sergeant Curtis Oates from the New York Police Department arrived to inspect the crime scene. Rosemary's body was almost completely covered in blood. She was lying face down with a 9-inch knife still lodged in her back. Looking at the multiple stab wounds on Rosemary's body, the detectives could tell that she had suffered an extremely painful death. Detectives also noticed that Rosemary's throat had been slit, and the defense of bruises suggested that Rosemary had put up a fight against her attacker during the struggle between the two. Outside the apartment in the lobby, there was more evidence that supported their theory. Detectives found stains of blood smeared across the wall next to the elevator. However, there was no traces of blood inside the elevator. This led the detective to search the staircase of the building, and on the 10th floor across a flight of stairs, there was another trail of blood. Detectives now believed that sometime during the struggle, Rosemary had managed to wound her attacker. Detectives were sure that the blood found smeared across the elevator wall, and on this staircase 13 floors below Rosemary's apartment belonged to the person who killed Rosemary. This gave detectives an idea about how Rosemary's killer might have escaped the building. At first, they thought of taking the elevator and pressed the button with his blood-covered hands and left a trail on the wall. But perhaps the elevator was taking too long, or maybe they thought that given their messy appearance, someone in the elevator might suspect them. They then thought it would be best to take the stairs if they wanted to leave the building without being noticed, and that was what they did. While the blood stains were a strong piece of evidence in the case, it didn't give detectives an idea of who the killer might be. The samples were obtained and preserved for further testing and future use. Later, an autopsy confirmed that Rosemary had been stabbed a total of 39 times, out of which 8 wounds were on her back. The knife found jammed into Rosemary's back belonged to a set from her own kitchen. This made the detectives believe that Rosemary's murder was probably not a premeditated one. They came up with a theory that when the attacker entered Rosemary's apartment, they initially didn't have any intentions of killing her. But when a struggle ensued, they did it anyway. And since there were some items missing from the apartment, it seemed like robbery was the motive behind the tragic incident. A few days after the murder, a funeral was held for Rosemary at Granby Cemetery, Granby, Hartford County, Connecticut, USA. Her loved ones gathered around to pay their respects, and she was laid to rest. Months went by, but there weren't any new developments in the case. Even with strong evidence and convincing theories, detectives were having a hard time coming up with any leads to follow. Soon, the police department diverted their attention to a fresh trail of murders in New York, and Rosemary's case went cold. More than 2 years later, in May 1999, Detective Kevin Lawler from the NYPD was assigned to the cold case squad and handed Rosemary's case. Skimming through Rosemary's case file, he had an idea of how he was going to move forward with the case. With assistance from Detective Mark Tebbins, Detective Lawler got the blood samples found on the elevator wall and in the staircase re-examined. The forensics department was successful in developing a DNA profile of Rosemary's killer, and it was uploaded to the Combined DNA Index System, or simply CODIS, which is a nationwide database of DNA profiles. All the detectives needed to do now was wait and hope for a match. After another 2 years, on August 20th, 2001, Detective Lawler received a phone call from the NYPD crime lab regarding Rosemary's case. There finally was a match through CODIS, and the person was identified at 28-year-old Charles Jones. Detective Lawler had been desperately awaiting this call, and now that he had the information he needed, he wasted no time in investigating the genetic link further. In order to make sure that he wasn't missing anything out, he performed a background check on Jones and uncovered some intriguing information. Originally, Jones wasn't linked to Rosemary's murder, but since he had been imprisoned after pleading guilty to a robbery and assault of another Co-op City resident on August 13, 1998, he was required to submit a DNA sample right before being released on August 10, 2001. And then on August 20, 2001, when Jones' DNA profile was uploaded on CODIS, it matched with the sample that belonged to Rosemary's killer. Furthermore, at the time of Rosemary's murder, Jones himself lived in Coop City, just a couple blocks from her apartment. While this strengthened the elevator against Jones, it still wasn't enough for Detective Lawler to charge Jones yet. Detective Lawler was quick to realize that while the blood sample evidence did place Charles Jones in the building at the time of the murder, it did not place him in any way inside Rosemary's apartment where the murder took place. This could completely destroy the detective's theory of Rosemary's murder and give Jones a chance to escape. Detective Lawler and Detective Tebbins needed more information and stronger evidence to put Jones behind bars. They decided to head over to Jones's house and have a talk with him. When the detectives arrived at Jones's place, they were told that he wasn't home at the time and that they should come back later. Since they didn't have solid evidence against Jones yet, they had to be extremely careful about the case, as even a slight misstep could cause all their progress to be lost. They didn't want anyone in Jones's family to learn about the reason behind their visit, which could tip him off and give him another chance to escape. And so they left a message for Jones saying that he had an outstanding traffic violation and they only wanted to talk to him to clear it. The detectives had to leave Jones' house without seeing him, but not without setting up a trap for him. A couple of days later, Jones took the bait and showed up to the precinct to talk about his traffic violation. The next steps were going to be very crucial, as Jones would soon be made aware of the real reason why he was called in for questioning. Detectives wanted to create a comfy environment for Jones before confronting him. After 30 minutes of being nice to Jones, the detectives began the interrogation. Even though Jones seemed nervous, he still wasn't breaking, and so detectives threw in some facts to shake his confidence. They told him that the blood found in the building of Rosemary's apartment belonged to him, and that was enough evidence to link him to Rosemary's murder. Listening to this information, Jones changed his story. The process still didn't seem like it was working. Detective Lawler had to do something more to break Jones and get a clear confession out of him. He walked up to his desk, picked up an envelope, and pulled out a bunch of pictures and laid them on the table in front of Jones. The picture showed Rosemary's body lying cold and lifeless on her kitchen floor. Detective Lawler thought this might drive Jones into admitting his guilt, but he was wrong. The tensions were now high even after several attempts of making him speak the truth, but the detectives were not letting him go anywhere. The interrogation went on for another 8 hours and only came to an end when Jones finally gave in. He decided to confess to the murder and cut a deal for his plea bargain. By stating a straight 8, Jones meant that he would serve only 8 years in prison for a full confession of the murder. By now, Jones had realized that there was no way out of this mess. One way or another, he would have to give in and suffer the damage for his actions, but thankfully Jones chose wisely. Instead of contesting the accusations against him, he gave Detectives Lauer a full confession, hoping that it would help him during his sentencing. According to Jones, the whole incident was merely a misunderstanding. He was persistent that Rosemary attacked him first, and he only acted in self-defense. However, something about this confession wasn't sitting well with the detectives. At the time of the murder, Jones was 23 years old, almost 6 feet tall, A well-built tall man defending himself from a 5'4" elderly woman seemed like a made-up story. While it did seem like this wasn't premeditated murder, the detectives weren't fully on board with the idea that Jones acted in self-defense. Charles Jones was arrested on Friday, August 24, 2001, and charged with robbery in the murder of Rosemary Pacenta. Jones was made aware that if he contested the accusations against him in the court and lost, it would end in a lengthy murder trial with a possible death penalty as the outcome. On the morning of January 11, 2002, in the Bronx County Courthouse, Jones pleaded guilty to a charge of first-degree manslaughter and was handed a sentence of 19 years behind bars. Charles Jones's capture brought closure to many of the Bronx residents, but especially to Rosemary's loving neighbors. Even though their friend was long gone, she would never be forgotten. Rosemary's case being solved brought a huge amount of relief to her family and friends. Belinda Bailey, one of Rosemary's neighbors and friends, said that her friend's murder remained a mystery for almost 4 years, and those 4 years were the most painful for her. She lived right down the hall from Rosemary's apartment, and whenever she crossed it, she would think of her. Even though it took some time, the detectives were able to solve Rosemary's case through DNA technology and bring closure to her loved ones. Detectives are now determined to implement the same technology to crack thousands of other cold cases and serve justice to victims like Rosemary and their families. Jones's confession told a different story from what the detectives had theorized. Do you think he was hiding the whole truth or not? Apart from Rosemary, Jones was linked to another assault from 1998. Do you think there are more cases in which Jones escaped from undetected? Let us know your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.